Call them change makers.
Call them rule breakers.
We call them redefiners.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Redefiners. Hoda is off today, so like our guest, I'll be navigating solo. As you think about today's edition of Redefiners, what's the most outrageous dream you might have? How far outside your comfort zone would you really actually be willing to go, and would you pursue it? Would you stick with it? One of the great joys of when writing my book, Sustainable Leadership, was I called a group of people moonshotters. And they were ready to shoot for the moon. That's to go into action without having all the answers or all the solutions. And today we're going to speak with someone who is also a moonshotter, who has shown what grit and determination is and just jumping in and getting on with it again and again and again. Not only are we excited about her sense of adventure, literally and physically, but I'm happy to call her a dear friend. We are both sailors, both blue water sailors. We've done the Fastnet race together twice. Our guest today is none other than Dee Caffari MBE. Dee is British and in 2006 set a world record by becoming the first woman to have sailed solo, non-stop circumnavigation around the world in both directions. She's now sailed around the world 6 times. So bear in mind, every sailor hopes and dreams that they might sail around the world. Probably 99% do not. And the 1% that do it once, much less 6 times. Dee is modest. She does not like to be talked about a lot. So I would encourage you to read her bio because she'll get mad at me if I go through it all in detail in her incredible successes. But most importantly is she has signed on to the Famous Project, which you're going to hear a lot about in the next year. That team has set their sights on the Jules Verne Trophy, which is how fast you can sail around the world, and they hope to secure the first world record for the fastest circumnavigation with an all-female crew. Outside of sailing, Dee's passionate about the critical importance of reducing dependence on plastics. She's chair of the World Sailing Trust, the advisory board of A Plastic Planet, patron of Sail for Cancer, and St. Mary's Junior Sailing. So without any other ado, I just want to say, Dee, welcome to Redefiners. I'm glad we've caught you on land long enough to do this discussion. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here and lovely to see you again, and without a wave splashing between us.
I know. So before we get into some of these crazy stories and also lessons learned about leadership alone and with teams, just step back to Hertfordshire. Hertfordshire couldn't be farther from the ocean. Where did you grow up? How did you grow up? And what led to eventually getting on sailboats?
Well, I was landlocked for a lot longer than people probably realise, because the assumption, if you're going to be a professional sailor, is that you grow up sailing as a kid, working your way through the dinghies, the boats get bigger, the experience gets bigger, and that's how you progress. But I didn't really have that childhood at all. I grew up going to ballet classes and tap classes in landlocked Hertfordshire, which is just north of London. And through my schooling, I always wanted to be a dancer. And then I played more and more sport and realized that it was quite a fickle environment to be a professional dancer. There's no guarantees, and sport had taken over by then. A lot of my friends went to university, so I was thinking, well, maybe I should too. So my father was happy with that decision, but I did choose a degree that had the highest capacity of practical element possible. And I did a sports science degree, and the sport took over the dancing, opportunities arose, and I became a PE teacher. But one of my aspects of my degree through sports science was I majored in outdoor activities. And that was my first real exposure to sailing. And I went up to the Lake Districts and sailed on little lakes inland. And I was at university in Leeds, which is landlocked in the middle of the country as well in the UK. But it was when I went to the west coast of Scotland, the Outer Hebrides, and we went sailing for a week. My biomechanics lecturer that was sailing with us, he said that he saw something then, because naturally when 2 boats are going in the same direction, there's a race on. And that was my opinion, whether the other person knew it or not. So he had he was not surprised at all when, after 5 years of teaching, I changed careers and took to the seas and achieved some of my laps of the planet.
Okay, so I've never heard it was the Outer Hebrides for the first week. For listeners who don't know the geography of the UK, the Outer Hebrides is about as far north, as far cold, and typically windy as one could ever find.
But it's stunning as well. And it's funny because it's up in the 58 degrees of north of latitude. And it's very similar to where Cape Horn is in the south. So we often liken going around Cape Horn to sailing around the top of Scotland. And the experience is quite similar. Stunning scenery, quite extreme weather. But if you get it on a good day, it's magical. So
you hadn't done any blue water sailing, I believe, until you were 27. Is that right?
That's right. And it was a career change. So my father sadly passed away when I was teaching. And I was very easily led as a child. I was inspired by everything I saw. I saw people put out fires and I wanted to be a firefighter. I saw people fly jets and I wanted to fly jets. And I had all these dreams and aspirations. And I said, I'm going to sail in the summer and I'm going to ski in the winter. I had a very rose-tinted view of the world. And he just said to me, you're going to talk about all this stuff or are you actually going to go and do it? Because pretty soon you're going to be too old to do any of it. And I think that's the bit that struck me. And I realized then that actually life is short and you have to make the most of it. There was more to life out there and I started investigating and then came back with the surprise notion to my mother that I was going to change careers.
And you did. And you went straight into an around the world race on Challenge. Is that correct?
I changed careers, got some qualifications, and what qualifications allow you to do is have the ticket that allows you to get the experience. And that's quite key, I think, because a piece of paper is great, but it's only by covering the mileage, as you know, from your own experience, that you start to amass the experience that can handle all the different conditions. But I had changed careers. I'd been a corporate skipper, to taking guests out sailing, giving them the experience of the lifetime, doing some races. So I'd crossed the Atlantic, I'd done my Fastnet, I'd kind of earned my mileage a little bit. And I had an opportunity to be a skipper in the Global Challenge, the Che Blythe's race. And that was in 2004. So it was literally 4 years later of my first round the world opportunity. And it was quite emotional.
It had ups and downs, which again, many years later, I've never seen you in a down. I'm not sure you have them, but I'm sure you do. But I've only seen you in ups in all seriousness. Describe 4 years in, what is a down in the middle of an ocean and with other people?
So I was taking on my first round the world, responsible for the boat, and more importantly, responsible for the 17 people that had paid for the experience to be there. So it's a massive responsibility. And you're out in the middle of the ocean. So it's not easy to get advice. You don't really have that support network there. Everyone's looking at you. And on top of that, every 6 hours, you get a position report of how you're faring against the 11 other identical boats doing exactly the same thing as you. So if you're doing really well, everything's very rosy. It's easy to keep people happy when life is good. But as soon as you start losing some miles, or you have a mistake with a sail and you've got then to repair something and the pressure's on, everyone looks at you in a slightly different way. And through naivety, I think back then, I was unaware of the skills required to lead a team. And it was probably my biggest learning curve there. I naively thought at the beginning that I needed to be everyone's friend. And I learned 2 lessons. One, it's pretty lonely at the top. And that's why you're paid the bucks to make the big decisions that not everyone's going to agree with. And you have to make those difficult decisions that not everybody agrees with and take responsibility and own them. And that's where the up and down. And I always joke and say that's probably what led to me sailing solo the following lap.
So I have always wanted to, but never have, taken a group of clients, boardroom, C-suite, CEOs, or my colleagues when I was CEO of our firm, out on a 24-hour excursion on a boat. Because a couple of things you learn, just for our listeners, everybody has a role. You actually have to work together successfully, because if you don't, something breaks, or worse, someone gets physically hurt. I mean, this is the reality of Mother Nature in sailboats. Dee, Mike Golding, who, again, for our listeners might not know, is arguably one of the most experienced, respected circumnavigators of the world. He said you were a different person when you came back from that trip than when you left, as it related to leadership and your strengths as a leader. Can you describe one of the low points and one of the high points of that round the world race with others as a leader, as your first time leader?
Yeah. And I remember before I left, he suggested that I was too emotional to take on this role. And I think now with hindsight looking back, he had a point. He was right. It was quite an emotional roller coaster, which is using a lot of energy that doesn't actually help matters. But back then it was a case of when you're trying to get the team to communicate and collaborate and work together and be efficient, you actually have to have them all based on the same objective and buy into the same cause. And if you start to get a rift or a rumbling, you actually have to address it and not let it develop. And I think I was very susceptible to the rumblings. And it's quite hard to address it head on, but it does clear it up and get rid of it straight away. And if you do let it continue, it escalates and you get the divisions on the boat. And I fell foul to that. But equally, when the chips were down, everybody really pulled together and did well. So there were times where you're like, I'm really proud of everybody and we've really come together. And then there was other times where you felt like I didn't have them and I'd lost that kind of control. And it's interesting that now if I was to go back into that position, which I've done in similar ways, but in a different arena, the lessons learned are valuable and you probably learn your best lessons from the mistakes. If it's all easy, you kind of just flow along. But when it goes wrong and you've got to dig deep and it's miserable and you get a bit upset by it, you learn your biggest lessons, I think.
I'm very conscious, not just with you, but with other women of saying, well, she was the first woman to do this or a woman who did that many times. Because you, with all due respect, you're a great sailor and you happen to be a woman. Okay. Do you think someone else would have said a man would have been too emotional?
It's really hard, and that line is so fine and hard to define. And we all talk about being sailors, the skills as a sailor, not as a not as a gender. But it does have to be acknowledged. And you're right. Somebody wouldn't have said to a guy, oh, you're too emotional. So, where is the okay and where is the not? And if a female generally is assertive, it can be considered aggressive. And that definition of where leadership sits and the attributes of being a leader, I think they're still different depending on what gender you are. And I think we're getting better at addressing it because people are saying that it's not okay to say that. But it's still quite slow. And in our sport, it's particularly slow.
When you think about risk taking and your first solo trip, and you were a leader that came back differently than you left. What was it like to go solo and dealing with it all alone? So you didn't have the challenges of ups and downs, but you were alone. Like, how did that go the first or the second time? So
my first solo trip was the emotional roller coaster. So I'd kind of got rid of the man management aspect that was distracting me and I could just focus on me, but actually learning to live 24 hours a day with yourself was something I'd underestimated. I was so busy thinking I'm going to sail this boat on my own without the 17 crew. I kind of forgot of the psychological aspect of it. And initially I was thinking, and I think anybody that does endurance sports or that kind of like really big kind of commitment that takes a long time, a lot of energy is has a massive effect on your emotions. So I was crying one minute and I was loving it the next minute, and I had no understanding of what was influencing these emotions that were coming out of me. All I knew was it was using a lot of my energy. So the transition from my first solo trip to the second solo trip was all about the sports psychology, understanding me and how I reacted. 9 times out of 10, I needed to drink something, eat something, have a little sleep, and then life became beautiful again. But it took me a long time to learn that. And now, I'm pretty pleased to say, and you've seen it because we sailed together, I'm pretty even and I'm almost annoyingly positive nearly all the time.
You are annoyingly positive. There's no question. 3:00 in the morning, we're soaked, we're freezing, we're hungry, and Dee bounces down below and says, so, anyone fancy a cup of tea? How are you? It's a true story. I'm not exaggerating. Drive me bonkers. I got to tell you. No, sorry to interrupt.
But it is meant to be enjoyable, and I just remind you of that. That's all.
You do, and you make it enjoyable because you're a positive force. So interestingly, you've just said something twice. When you were managing and everyone looked at you, you didn't have to be their friend. You had to make tough decisions. It took a lot of energy, and you learned you could have saved that energy. And then in your first solo, the effect on you took a lot of energy alone. And until you had a sports psychologist help you channel the energy. So in both ways, you look at how you mastered energy as an endurance athlete. I found that interesting, both extremes.
Yeah, definitely. It was no good them sending me a message or speaking to me on the satellite phone saying, well, Clarke's going faster than you, because I couldn't actually do anything about what you're doing on your boat. I could only manage the things I could manage. So it needed a conversation to be, are you happy with your boat speed? Have you got the right sail plan up? All the positive things that I could say, actually, you know what? I could probably put a bigger sail up. I'm good here. And that's now I've practiced it so much. It goes with that positive attitude that I generally have the positive language, and therefore the positive attitude comes as a result of that.
So there's a story I'd like to hear your side of. Dee and I have a common friend, Mike Broughton. And Mike, former Royal Navy helicopter pilot, one of the world's great weather routers. So he would be on a radio or email to Dee in various places in the world explaining what weather was coming to her the next day or the next few days. And he told me at the end of the Fastnet race this summer, he had to give her a report, and then he was going to his best friend's birthday party. The weather report was winds of up to 50 to 55 knots of wind, huge seas. I don't know if it was snowing or not as well. And he wanted to give her positive news, so he said it might go up to 50. He didn't tell her how high it might go. I'd like to hear that, the other side of that. But he stayed by the radio that night and never went to the party, even though people kept calling him, because he didn't know if she would be alive the next day because the weather was going to get so bad. Okay, Dee, what is your version of the same story?
Oh, pretty similar, even though I didn't realize I'd upset his party plans. But it was interesting as his communication evolved during the Southern Ocean. I mean, this was when I went the wrong way around the world on my own. So against the prevailing winds and currents, down the bottom of the Atlantic turn right, just so everyone can get the geography. And so you're going upwind. And as the depressions come towards you, the safest sector is always in the south. And they just seem to be continuous. And every time I kind of got through one, there'd be another one. And so every time I thought I could get a little respite, I'd have to push further south, and it just gets that little bit colder. The risk of ice is there. And I sensed at first it was like the wind range will be in 45 to 50. And then it was like 44 to 49. And it was just, he couldn't bring himself to put above 50. And I'd be like, I had 55 knots. What were you thinking? And then it evolved to 50 plus. And I think, we worked it out that I'd spent, out of 88 days down there, I'd spent nearly 80% at winds above 50 knots. And it's amazing you get used to it. So I was telling everybody, it was lovely today. I actually took a shower because it was only 35 knots. Now, in reality, 35 knots is still gale force winds that most people choose not to go sailing in. So it all depends what you get used to. But it was, I think, maybe harder for Mike just giving the information, not really knowing how I was dealing with it, rather than for me, who was acclimatizing to these conditions because it seemed normal after a while.
You are afraid of heights. And the trip, you had to go to the top of the mast, fix something, and you got frozen halfway up the mast all alone. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it hasn't really helped my fear of heights, that's for sure. But it's not a good place to be. And it's amplified 10 times worse when you go up the mast and then there's no one left on the deck to look after you or control the boat. So now you're relying on equipment to be driving the boat while you're fixing something up the mast. And sailboats to this day still have really intricate electronic pieces at the top of the mast that when you're in a lightning storm often get struck and often need to be replaced. Now imagine you've got a mast that's 2 stories high, swinging around in the breeze. Even in a gentle sea state, that movement is exaggerated at the top of the mast. And as you go up the mast, there's a moment on the rope that you're going up where in the middle, you've got the least kind of traction on it. It's the most loose it can get. You're not at the bottom where it's quite tight or at the top where it feels quite tight. You're in this middle section. And it was there that I got stuck. I'd literally just jammed the system that I was using to go up the mast. So my koala impression was doing really well. And you kind of look around, and I had a little cry to myself, and I was thinking, well, that's not going to help. I was like, right, what else can I do? And it took me an hour and a half to talk myself through disconnecting myself from the climbing stuff. So all the safety systems you put in place, actually letting that go and getting myself down and then sorting out the mess. And I was so relieved when I did that. I had a really good cry then. And then I was like, oh, I've got to tell everybody, because one of the things you do when you're on your own sailing is you let somebody at home, you send a message back saying, I'm going up the mast, and you let them know when you're back down again. But I was so emotional throughout the whole trauma, and I'd obviously been swinging around the mast for a while, that I was like, God, they must be quite worried by now. So I did it. And then, of course, the worst thing was I never actually got to the top to fix it. So I still had that job to do. But it's, now I think definitely when you're sailing in a crew, you need to establish that who is that person that's going to go up the mast, so I can make sure it's not going to be me.
So bringing you back to perhaps more normal challenges, there any of us that want to do something different? They want to push themselves harder. They want to go for a goal that they almost are certain they can't achieve. What's your advice?
I've thought about this, of what made me do it, because I didn't have the answers. I didn't know I could do it. And I possibly didn't think it all through fully, but maybe that was one of the answers, as in, don't overthink it and surround yourself with people that support you getting there or want you to achieve, because it's really hard to do stuff on your own. You need a network of people that you can draw on to help you get there. And I think once everybody is around you, you suddenly look and you think, well, they all believe in me, so I need to believe in myself. And it does help your self-belief and your self-confidence. And then you've committed to it. So then you're like, I like to say I'm tenacious. Other people would say I'm stubborn, but I'm definitely not going to let myself down once I've committed to it. And I find the other thing, if I put it out there, if I say it out loud, it becomes real. If it's just a inner dialogue in your mind, you can talk yourself out of it because no one knows, so you don't have to admit failure. But if you put it out there, then you kind of got to find the pathway to get yourself there. And I think that really helps. Talk
about exhaustion as a businesswoman, business leader, as well as the physical exhaustion on boats. How do you think about stamina, exhaustion, sleep, etc.?
I think it's really important that you learn to understand yourself, what works for you and what doesn't. And what works for one person might not necessarily work for everyone. But you try and make it work to your advantage. So flying into New York, I was waking up at 4:00 in the morning thinking, oh, my day started really early. But I'd go for a run, get the fresh air, make me feel better, have a little stretch, go for a nice breakfast. And I had that routine that actually helped me feel better about myself, and I managed the conditions. And it is easy to get fatigue. But I think if you can eat right, drink right, like do the best you can for yourself, you can manage that. And I think if I go to the extremes where I'm sailing and people's lives are relying on me, or my life's in my hands, it's that commitment of the storm won't last forever, it will pass. I will come out of this, but actually I'm responsible, and I've got to be responsible in this scenario because it's pretty bad. And, I've got to step up here.
When you're on teams now, as opposed to some of the reflections earlier about the first go round, and there's underperformers or someone may not be as educated, but there's urgency, there's danger, there's risk. How do you lead if someone's not pulling their weight or isn't as experienced, but yet you might have a dangerous situation?
They need to be managed a little bit differently. So if it is a dangerous situation, you need to, number one, at all times, make sure everyone's safe. So if they shouldn't be involved at all, then you need to extract them from that situation until it's, in a position where you can involve them again. If it's not dangerous, but they're underperforming or they don't know what they're doing or they need some guidance, I see that as one of my roles, to help develop the sailors around me as well. And you put them in a role where you can keep an eye on, or it's quite a simple job that you need them to do. And then you give them the confidence to do that. And I think it's really important that everyone's experience or contribution is a positive one. So they feel that they've positively contributed and they're valued. And that helps their self-belief and self-confidence. So it helps them develop in their progress.
We asked everyone on Redefiners, was there a redefining moment specifically for you that you reflect on?
I thought about this in advance of this conversation, and I was struggling because I think there's many. I feel like every time I take on a challenge, I'm almost redefining myself. Like, what am I trying to prove? I've learned so many things that I want to put it into practice and step up to the next level. So I feel like I'm constantly redefining myself. So
not many people have heard of the Jules Verne. Can you just give a 60 seconds about what this is and what it means in the history of sailing, this concept?
Well, the Jules Verne Trophy, quite simply, is the fastest lap of the planet. You choose the boat, you choose the team, you choose the weather window. You have to start at the Ushant Lighthouse in the north corner of France. You go down the Atlantic, round Antarctica, back up and cross the finish line. And at the moment, the record stands at 40 days, 23 hours. And that's stood for 7 years now. Now, the famous project that I'm now part of has got possession of the boat that did that record. And we're going to see if we can do it.
It's fantastic. Every listener needs to follow it. It's in 2025, is that correct?
That's correct, yes. So the boat's in the shed now getting worked on, and we're training on a 70-foot trimaran, which is a little more on the edge. It's very responsive. So we're almost training hard to race easy. That's the theory. The big boat, 100-foot trimaran, will come out of the shed April, May next year. And so we'll have 18 months to set some records, do some training and prepare ourselves. And we're looking to go for the Jules Verne Trophy in the winter of 2025.
We've talked a lot about physicality, leadership, patience. Comment on the power of nonverbal communication, particularly in teams and boats.
I think it's quite hard in the sailing environment. You've got so many layers on, so many obstacles to our eyes and our facial expressions, and even our body language sometimes, that it can be misleading, and that miscommunication is sometimes the issue on boats. But I think, all teams need to feel optimistic, they need to feel empowered, and they need to feel that they're trusted to do their job. And if you can give them that environment, then they thrive. But as a leader, you have to sometimes be a bit of a swan, paddle like mad underneath, but look serene and happy on the top.
So, Dee, we end every episode with some rapid fire questions. You have to just answer instantly with what comes first into your head. Are you ready to go?
So long as the answer is Haribo, yes.
Yeah. So for those who don't travel in England, she likes Haribo candy, and she had a lot of it in the boat. Her pockets were full of it. So I have no candy. I'm sorry. Okay. First question. What would you be doing if you were not sailing?
A paramedic.
Second question. You're stuck at sea and you're competing with a Michelin-starred chef to make food out of freeze-dried. What would you serve?
Oh, I'm rubbish at that. Pasta. It'd be pasta, some form of pasta.
What's the best surprise you've ever received?
Clean pants in the Southern Ocean.
That's a good answer. If your English Springer, Jack, could give us inside information about you, what would we learn from him?
That I don't smell the same when I come from an offshore.
Yeah, Jack probably runs the other way.
He recognizes the voice, but he definitely doesn't like the smell.
There you go. What's your go-to routine that keeps you grounded?
Fresh air, a little bit of me time, and surrounding myself with supportive, loving people.
That's a recipe for all of us. Last one. If you could pick the crew of anyone alive or dead, and they have no sailing experience, they're just there because of who they are, who would you pick to join the boat?
The Murphy clan, without question. I'll take you all.
I did not pay for that response, I promise you, but the Murphy clan will be very happy to hear it. So, Dee, thank you so much for being with us today. A lot of lessons about leadership, about reflection, confidence, risk-taking. Cannot thank you enough. And all of your races, we wish you well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dee.